In the last video, we looked at one of the really important popular movements within Mahayana Buddhism, and that was the movement of Pure Land Buddhism. And we talked about how it began in India, and we described some of the important goals, beliefs, and practices, and eventually saw it move to China, where we had the emergence of Guanyin for Chinese Pure Land Buddhists. So in this video, we're going to look at another really important Mahayana popular movement. It's not like those philosophical schools that are very difficult to understand and not very accessible to the average Buddhist. These are popular movements and therefore have a lot to do with that Mahayana focus on lay spirituality. So this is Chan Buddhism. That's the Chinese name for this Mahayana movement. And it's an interesting movement because partly we think that it might have been the first Buddhist movement to actually begin outside of India. We cannot really trace this movement that we see emerge in China around the 6th century of the Common Era back to India. So it seems that it actually began in China, and it was started by a guy named Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma is the founder of Chan Buddhism. He is an Indian monk, but by the time it seems that he started this new path to enlightenment as another form of Mahayana Buddhism, he was already in China. So the movement actually begins in China. Now Chan is traced back to a Sanskrit term, maybe a little bit oversimplified, but we can just think of Chan as meaning meditation. And that's helpful because meditation is going to be absolutely central to Chan Buddhism. Chan Buddhism is not going to be about a lot of complex doctrines or complex rituals. Bodhidharma wanted to focus inward, wanted to focus on the self, or at least who we are in this particular lifetime, as the location for the possibility of attaining nirvana. So in some ways, this looks a little bit more like Theravada Buddhism because it is about self-power rather than other power. The other power is like what we saw with Pure Land Buddhism, with that reliance on the grace of the Buddha of the Pure Land. This is more about self-power, but it's still a Mahayana movement because you still have this openness for lay spirituality. You still have some new teachings and new ideas that are justified through expedient means. So you still have some of those Mahayana features, but definitely not the focus on those spiritually advanced beings that we saw with Pure Land. So Chan is about this direct kind of intuitive experience of meditation that can lead you to nirvana rather than a reliance upon complex rituals and complex doctrines. Bodhidharma always says that that experience is about pointing directly to the heart rather than on understanding those doctrines or performing those rituals. Again, Chan begins maybe around the 6th century of the Common Era in China. It will continue. There will be a list of patriarchs who are major figures within Chan Buddhism. There will be a really interesting connection between Chan Buddhism and the martial arts that is always interesting to explore. Eventually, we end up seeing two different subgroups within Chan Buddhism. And I want to say a little bit about these two subgroups. They're listed here on the screen. The first is Linji and the second is Chaodong. These are the Chinese names of the subgroups of Chan Buddhism. Linji is named after a man who was named Linji. And the story is really fascinating. Linji was studying Chan Buddhism. He had kind of gone as far as he could with his entry-level teacher, and it was time for him to study with the master of the monastery. And he goes to the master and says, I'm ready to learn directly from you about this path to enlightenment. Right? And the idea is that you go and learn from this master. It's interesting, the story that even Bodhidharma tells about Chan is that it actually began with our Buddha himself. Remember, a lot of these Mahayana movements that are moving beyond Theravada teachings still claim to that the Buddha himself was the one who originally taught these messages, but that maybe they were kept secret until we were all ready to hear these more advanced teachings. So the story that Bodhidharma gives is that the Buddha himself actually was ready to give a Dharma talk, and instead of speaking, he just held up a single flower, and everybody was dumbfounded except for one disciple who experienced nirvana through that direct intuitive meditation on the flower that was being held up by the Buddha. So that's the story that is used to actually trace the lineage of Chan back to our Buddha, even though we're talking about 1,000 years after Buddha, where the movement of Chan finally begins. But back to Lin Ji. Lin Ji was now also ready to study directly with this Chan master in order to refine the ability of meditation to experience nirvana. And he goes to the master, says, "I'm ready to be your student." And the master takes a stick and hits Lin Ji upside the head. And Lin Ji, of course, is hurt, and there are bruises and blood and all kinds of stuff. He goes back to his original teacher, tells him what happens. The teacher says, "Well, try again." He goes back a second time. Same thing happens. Goes back a third time. He gets hit again. At this point, he's ready to give up. And before he gives up, the master tells him, "I want you to go and talk to this old hermit monk who's living up there in the mountains, maybe in a cave somewhere. And I want you to talk to him before you give up entirely." Lin Ji says, "Fine, I'll go talk to him." He goes and talks to him. He tells him what happened. And the monk's response is very strange, right? You'd expect some sympathy for the guy who's got these big bruises on his head and dried blood all over the place. And instead, the monk says, "Oh, I feel so sorry for the master of the monastery. He must have grown so tired as he had to keep hitting you so many times." Right? Very strange response. And in that moment, it is said that Lin Ji broke out in laughter. And it is said that instantly, at that moment, he was able to attain enlightenment. And the idea within Lin Ji Buddhism is that, yes, you need to work your way through a lot of this meditation, but that enlightenment is something that happens all of a sudden. It's a sudden breakthrough. And often the understanding is that our minds get in the way. And we try to understand reality in our own way. And we plan how things are going to happen in the world. And we need to somehow get shocked out of our normal way of thinking so that enlightenment can burst into our mind. And the idea is that when that hermit monk gave that very strange response to the story of what had happened, Lin Ji was shocked out of trying to explain things and to understand things in his own way, and his mind was open for this breakthrough of enlightenment to enter into him. So Lin Ji Buddhism, as a subgroup of Chan Buddhism, is going to continue, and it will often focus on practices that might produce that sudden breakthrough. So for example, you still have stories of Lin Ji Chan masters who might be walking around their students who are in a state of meditation, and they might all of a sudden come up and hit them upside the head. Or maybe they'll come behind them and shout really loudly, again, to try to shock their minds out of their normal way of thinking so that enlightenment can burst in. Lin Ji Buddhists will also make a lot of use of what are called koans, right? This term here that is on the screen is the Japanese word for this practice that begins in China. And the koans are these short paradoxical phrases. And the idea is that by meditating on a paradox, on something that doesn't make perfect sense, that might be the practice that can shock us out of trying to explain everything and understand everything, shock us out of our normal way of thinking so that enlightenment can burst in. So one of the more famous koans is for a Lin Ji master to tell his students to go home and to meditate on the sound of one hand clapping. Right? We think traditionally, two hands to clap. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Right? It's a paradox. And the idea is by thinking about something and meditating on something that doesn't make perfect sense to our minds, we can end up getting our minds out of the way so that enlightenment can burst in. So koans become a really important practice within Lin Ji Chan Buddhism. Okay? The other subgroup that I've mentioned here is Chao Dong. Chao Dong is about a more gradual approach to enlightenment. So the focus isn't on these sudden breakthroughs. It's on a gradual experience of meditation throughout one's life that will gradually lead one to the experience of nirvana. The idea is to gradually become a person who exists within a state of meditation. So Chao Dong Buddhists will often talk about focusing on meditation at all times, whether they're gardening or whether they are washing dishes or preparing meals, whatever it might be, the focus is always on a state of meditation. For this reason, Chao Dong Buddhists will make a lot of use of Zazen, this other term that's on the screen here. Again, it's a Japanese term, but for a practice that we can trace back to China. Zazen has to do with long hours of sitting meditation. So again, it's not about these practices that are going to cause this breakthrough. It's about long hours of sitting meditation where silence will help lead you to the gradual attainment of enlightenment. Now, it's not that Linji Buddhists don't make use of Zazen, long hours of sitting meditation, or that koans might not be used by Chaodong Buddhists. It's just that they have a different emphasis, and therefore one of those practices might be emphasized a little bit more by one group than the other. Okay? Now, eventually, when Chan Buddhists take their path to enlightenment through Korea and eventually to Japan, Chan Buddhism will be known as Zen Buddhism. And that's probably a term that many of you are more familiar with than with Chan Buddhism. So Zen is the Japanese version of Chan Buddhism, right? And because many of you might live in America or the West and an English-speaking portion of Western Europe, for example, who knows where, we have more interaction through Japan than we do with China throughout the last several hundred years, so therefore a lot of these terms are more familiar to us in the Japanese. So Zen is simply the Japanese term for Chan, and you also will end up having the same two subgroups in Japanese Zen Buddhism as you will within Chinese Chan Buddhism. So just like you have the Linji Buddhists in Chinese Chan, you have the Rinzai in Zen Buddhism, and you also have the Soto to match the Chaodong. I remember when I first learned this as an undergraduate student, I was told that the groups with the two I's go together and the groups with the two O's go together. So you can remember that Rinzai is the equivalent of Linji and Soto the equivalent of Chaodong. Rinzai and Linji both have two I's in the name. Soto and Chaodong both have two O's. So through Japan especially, Zen Buddhism becomes very popular, not only in Japan, but ultimately extending over to the West, even to a place like the United States, where Zen centers start popping up, especially near the end of the 20th century in the 60s and 70s, and Zen Buddhism becomes very popular even among people who were not raised within the Buddhist tradition as perhaps one of the more popular movements for those who want to seek more about the Buddhist path. So we've seen Pure Land as a first very popular movement within Mahayana, now Chan, founded by Bodhidharma and yet traced back to the Buddha himself with that story told about the flower. It's called the Flower Sermon. And then we saw eventually Chan break into those two subgroups with their different emphases, the different practices that are highlighted, especially by one of those subgroups, and then eventually the movement to Japan, where we see the new names given to Chan Buddhism as it makes its way to Japan.